Do you see her? James Langston leaned down toward Laura Carter as they approached the courthouse doors, his voice low but laced with smugness. Front bench, navy dress, Laura whispered back, her manicured fingers gripping his arm. She looks calm. Too calm. James chuckled. Good. Let her act composed. By the end of today, she'll be begging for scraps. The heavy oak doors of the courthouse swung open with a reverberating bang that carried through the marble lobby. It wasn't just an entrance, it was a performance. James Langston, billionaire tech mogul and media darling, strutted through like the building itself was an extension of his empire. His $1,000 Italian shoes clicked confidently against the polished floors. Every step was deliberate, echoing a message, I'm untouchable. At his side was Laura Carter, young, blonde, and strategically glamorous in a fiery red dress that hugged every curve. She clung to his arm like jewelry, her bright smile daring anyone to question her place there. To the crowd of reporters and onlookers lingering in the hallway, they were an unmistakable pair, a man who had it all and the woman he'd chosen to flaunt it with. Phones began to rise, lenses clicking. James didn't flinch. In fact, he leaned into the flash of cameras, flashing the kind of smirk that belonged to someone who believed he couldn't lose. Mr. Langston, is it true you're seeking sole custody of the children? Mr. Langston, how do you respond to claims of hidden assets? He ignored the questions, his smile never wavering. Laura, however, squeezed his arm and whispered with a breathy giggle, they'll see soon enough. You'll walk out richer, and she'll walk out ruined. Exactly, James murmured, his eyes narrowing with satisfaction. By tonight, Beck won't have a penny to her name. What he didn't notice, what he couldn't possibly comprehend, was the woman sitting quietly on a wooden bench just outside Courtroom B. Beck Langston sat with her hands folded neatly in her lap. She wore a navy blue dress, understated yet elegant, the kind of attire that communicated composure and seriousness without demanding attention. Her natural hair was pulled back into a simple bun, and her dark skin glowed under the harsh fluorescent lights. She didn't fidget, didn't look around nervously. She simply sat, watching. And her eyes, calm but sharp, held secrets James couldn't imagine. Where James's entrance was a performance, Beck's presence was quiet defiance. To the casual observer, she was just a soon-to-be ex-wife preparing to lose everything. To those who looked closer, the slight curve of her lips hinted at something else entirely, something closer to strategy than surrender. Mrs. Langston, came a steady voice beside her. It was Patricia Holmes, her lawyer, and one of the sharpest divorce specialists in the city. Patricia carried a thick folder, so heavy with documents that it seemed to weigh down her arm. She adjusted her glasses and leaned in slightly. Are you ready for this? Beck stood, smoothing down her dress with deliberate calm. I've been ready for this day for months, Patricia. She glanced toward the grand entrance where her husband was basking in his little parade. The real question is whether James is ready for what's coming. Inside Courtroom B, the atmosphere was heavy with anticipation. The judge's bench loomed high at the far end, a place where lives would be reshaped by the stroke of a gavel. Reporters and curious spectators filled the gallery, their whispers swirling through the air. Everyone loved a high-profile divorce, especially one involving a billionaire tech founder and his scorned wife. The bailiff's voice rang out, commanding silence. All rise. Court is now in session. The Honorable Judge Henry Whitaker presiding. Judge Whitaker, a gray-haired man with weary eyes, settled into his seat. He'd seen countless families destroyed in this very room, greed, betrayal, lies. But today, the stack of sealed documents on his desk made him pause. This case, he suspected, would not be like the others. The doors creaked again as James strode inside with his army of lawyers trailing behind. Laura peeled away, taking a prominent seat in the gallery where she could make her presence known to Beck. She crossed her legs deliberately, the scarlet fabric of her dress catching the light. Her posture screamed, I've already won. James took his seat at the defendant's table, leaning back with his signature smile, hands folded like a man about to close another billion-dollar deal. His lead attorney, a slick-talking man named Brian Keene, placed a stack of legal briefs before him. Your Honor, Keene began, not wasting a second, my client has discovered deeply disturbing truths about his marriage. We intend to prove that Mrs. Langston has not only been unfaithful, but that the paternity of the children in question is highly suspect. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Reporters scribbled furiously. James leaned back further in his chair, watching Beck for a reaction. He expected tears, panic, outrage. Instead, he saw her straighten her posture, her expression unreadable. No fear. No anger. Just calm. Beside her, Patricia Holmes whispered something into her ear, and Beck's lips curved ever so slightly into a knowing smile. For a flicker of a moment, James's smug confidence faltered. But he pushed the thought away, convincing himself that Beck was just putting on a brave face. He had no idea that the sealed envelope on Judge Whittaker's desk contained the very evidence that would dismantle his empire of lies. And he had no idea that the woman he thought was defenseless had been waiting for this exact moment, prepared for every move he was about to make. Beck's eyes stayed fixed on James as he sat at the defense table, whispering something to his lead attorney with that same practiced smirk. She could still see the boy he used to be beneath the billionaire polish, the boy she had once believed in. Against her will, her mind drifted backward, away from the sterile courthouse and into the warmth of a memory she could never quite escape. James Langston had not always been the arrogant man who strutted through life with cameras flashing. Once, he had been a broke dreamer in wrinkled shirts and scuffed sneakers, a man with fire in his eyes and nothing in his wallet. She remembered the first day she met him. She was behind the counter of a coffee shop near campus, her law books stacked like bricks behind her, fighting exhaustion after a double shift. He had walked in with messy hair, jeans, and the kind of weary determination only sleepless students wore. When he ordered, he surprised her by buying a coffee for her too. "You look like you need it more than I do," he'd said with a crooked smile. It was such a small gesture, but it caught her off guard. Most people didn't even notice her. James saw her. He asked what she studied, and when she said law, instead of rolling his eyes or making a tired joke, he leaned forward, asking what kind of law, what cases mattered to her, what she wanted to change in the world. That was how it began, with a conversation that lasted long after her shift, and another one the next day, and another the day after that. He started timing his coffee runs to match her breaks, and before long, she was looking for him at the door. Their first date wasn't glamorous. A tiny Italian restaurant off campus, sunflowers instead of roses, because he'd remembered she once mentioned they were her favorite. She saw the way his hands fidgeted with his napkin, nervous, as if impressing her mattered more than impressing any investor. "I think you're the most incredible woman I've ever met," he told her that night, voice shaking in a way that disarmed her. "Not because you're beautiful, though you are, but because you actually care. You care about things." She laughed at him then, teasing, "Your big tech dreams don't impress me. But the way you notice the small things, that does." 6 months later, his startup launched, and suddenly everything changed. Money trickled in, then flooded, but he didn't change, not yet. He insisted on paying for her law school tuition, told her partners lift each other up. When he proposed, he did it not at a glittering gala but in the garden behind the same coffee shop where they'd met. Their wedding was simple, heartfelt, not a show but a promise. She wore her grandmother's altered dress, and he cried when he saw her walking down the aisle. His vows were not about money or success, they were about her. "I promise to love you whether we're broke or successful. You'll always be my home." And for a while, he meant it. When she told him she was pregnant with twins, he acted as though the world had given him the greatest gift imaginable. He attended every appointment, read parenting books cover to cover, whispered promises against her stomach at night. When Noah and Naomi were born on a snowy December morning, he cradled them with tears streaming down his face. "They're perfect," he kept saying. "We made these perfect little people." For the first few years, he was there for every milestone, changing diapers, singing them to sleep, sneaking into their rooms to whisper that he would always protect them. He was still the man she had fallen in love with, still the partner who looked at her as though she was the axis of his universe. But somewhere around the twins' 3rd birthday, the shift began. By then, his company had gone public. He wasn't just wealthy anymore, he was a billionaire. And with that came the endless pressures of shareholders and competitors, of meetings stacked on top of meetings, of contracts so large they swallowed entire months of his life. He started coming home later, distracted, eyes always on his phone. "Just this deal," he would say. "Once it's closed, things will calm down." But they never calmed down. There was always another deal, another urgent call, another late flight. He became obsessed with his image, sharp suits, expensive watches, tailored diets, constant workouts. And then came the secrecy. The phone always face down on the nightstand. The whispered calls in the other room. The excuses that felt too smooth, too rehearsed. Beck wanted to believe it was just the strain of success, the crushing weight of running an empire. She convinced herself to be patient, to shoulder the burden at home, to protect their children from the growing distance between them. But her instincts whispered what her heart refused to accept: something was deeply wrong. The truth revealed itself one Tuesday evening. She was folding laundry when his phone, left charging on the dresser, lit up with a message that stole the air from her lungs. Missing you already, baby. Can't wait for our weekend in Miami. V. She froze, her hands shaking, telling herself it had to be spam, a mistake, anything but what it clearly was. But deep down, she knew. That night, when he came upstairs, she was waiting. The phone lay in her lap. "Who is Laura?" she asked quietly. He stopped cold in the doorway, all color draining from his face. For a long moment, he said nothing, and in that silence she saw everything she needed to know. "She's my assistant," he finally muttered. Beck's voice was calm but merciless. "Your assistant signs her texts with heart emojis? Your assistant calls you baby? Your assistant is planning a weekend with you in Miami while you told me you had a conference in Seattle." He dropped into a chair, shoulders sagging, the fight leaking out of him like air from a punctured tire. He tried to explain, to plead, to claim it just happened. But every excuse sounded smaller, weaker, and more insulting than the last. She had already scrolled through the messages, already seen the intimate exchanges, the discussions of a shared future, the way Laura sneered at her existence. "I made excuses for you," she said, tears finally spilling but her voice still steady. "I told myself you were under stress. I told myself success was changing you. I told myself to trust you. And all this time, you were planning to leave me. Planning to leave us." James reached for her hand, but she pulled away. "No. You don't get to say you love me. Love doesn't lie. Love doesn't sneak around hotels. Love doesn't make plans for a future that doesn't include me or our children." She stood, the weight of her decision pressing down on her but giving her strength at the same time. "The kids don't know. They won't, not until I figure out how to handle this. But tomorrow, we will talk about what happens next." She slept in the guest room that night, staring at the ceiling, knowing life as she had known it was over. She had loved him with everything she had. She had built a family, a home, a life with him. And he had chosen to throw it away for a woman who looked at him like a golden ticket. The next morning, she called Patricia Holmes, the friend from law school who had become one of the city's sharpest divorce attorneys. Because if James thought he could discard her, humiliate her, and strip her of everything she had built with him, he was about to learn just how badly he had underestimated the woman he once called his home. Laura Carter crossed her legs in the courtroom gallery, her crimson dress shimmering under the fluorescent lights like a warning flare. She made sure the hem rode just high enough to reveal the outline of her toned thigh, the kind of subtle display that always drew eyes. She wasn't just there to watch James's victory, she was part of the strategy. The final, decisive move in a game she had been playing for years. To the outside world, Laura was simply James Langston's assistant. That was how she had entered his orbit 2 years ago, resume polished to perfection, her smile bright enough to disarm suspicion, her references cleverly curated to withstand surface-level scrutiny. But her true occupation was something much different, much darker. Laura was a predator. James thought he had chosen her. He thought their late-night meetings had just happened. He believed he was the one breaking rules, crossing boundaries, taking risks for love. The truth was, every step had been orchestrated. Laura had studied James long before she applied for the position at his company. She knew his routines, his weaknesses, the cracks in his marriage. She knew when he traveled, how often he worked late, what kind of women he looked twice at. James was not her first mark. He was her third. Her first had been a California tech executive, brilliant, wealthy, and married to his college sweetheart. Laura had slipped into his company under the guise of an eager young assistant, listened to him complain about his wife not understanding him, stroked his ego until he was convinced she was the only one who truly saw him. Within 2 years, his marriage collapsed, and Laura walked away with a $5 million settlement disguised as a confidential payout. She spent less than half the money, the rest she invested, carefully, waiting for her next opportunity. The second was a real estate mogul in New York. Older, married, twice as arrogant. She targeted him differently, not as a naive assistant, but as a sultry socialite who accidentally met him at a charity gala. The pattern repeated: seduction, secret meetings, manipulation, and finally, a financial settlement that included a luxury penthouse. Another $7 million in her bank account. By the time she found James Langston, she was a professional. This wasn't romance. This wasn't even lust. It was business. And James, with his billions, his fragile ego, and his lonely marriage, was the biggest contract of her career. The beauty of men like James was how predictable they were. They all believed they were unique. They all believed the women in their lives didn't understand them. They all thought having an affair was their decision, their rebellion, their escape. In reality, Laura had been steering James from the moment she walked into his office with a portfolio and a smile. She remembered the first late night they worked together. James had been tired, his tie loosened, his patience thin. He'd sighed heavily, muttering something about Beck not understanding how much pressure he was under. Laura had leaned closer, her voice soft but firm. "You deserve someone who appreciates you, James. Someone who knows how extraordinary you are." She saw the way his eyes flickered at that, the way his shoulders straightened. It was the same look she'd seen in every man she'd ever targeted, the look of someone who had just been handed permission to betray. From there, it was easy. Dinners under the guise of late meetings. Subtle touches on his arm. Carefully chosen outfits that said "I'm available, but only for you." Within months, he was hers. Within a year, he was planning his exit from his marriage. Laura knew the endgame before James did. Beck was smart, too smart. If James tried to leave her cleanly, she would take half of everything. That was unacceptable. Laura wanted the billions untouched, the empire intact. And she wanted Beck erased. That was why she had coached James to question the twins' paternity. It was a brutal move, one that made even him hesitate at first. "They're my kids," he had argued one night, guilt creeping into his voice. "I was there when they were born. Laura silenced him with a kiss, pulling back just enough to whisper, "You can still love them. But you don't owe Beck your fortune. Don't let her trap you. If you question the children's paternity, she gets nothing. We get everything. And then we can finally live without hiding." She had pressed the words into him like venom, until he repeated them back to her as if they were his own ideas. That was how manipulation worked. Make him believe it was his choice, his brilliance, his courage. The offshore accounts had been her idea too. She'd given him the name of a discreet accountant, walked him through how to move money quietly, how to create shell companies to hide assets. James believed he was outsmarting his wife. In reality, he was following a script Laura had used before. Every transfer, every deception, was another strand in the web she was weaving around him. And now, here they were. Courtroom B. The day she had been waiting for. James thought he was about to crush his wife and secure his fortune. Laura knew this was the day Beck would be stripped bare, humiliated in front of reporters, left with nothing but her pride. She glanced at Beck across the room, sitting so still it almost looked like surrender. Laura allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. She had seen that look before in the wives of her previous marks. The quiet ones always broke hardest. In her mind, Laura was already living the life she had planned. Manhattan penthouse. Designer wardrobes. European vacations without the burden of secrecy. She would be Mrs. James Langston within the year, her name splashed across magazines, her face on red carpets. She would finally step into the world she had always believed was her due. And James, poor, arrogant James, would never realize that he was simply another stepping stone. He believed Laura loved him, believed she was impressed by his vision and brilliance. The truth was harsher. She loved what he represented. Wealth. Power. Freedom. He was not the destination. He was the vehicle. As Judge Whittaker adjusted the papers on his bench, Laura crossed her legs again, the movement deliberate, making sure the cameras caught her poised and beautiful. She whispered under her breath, just loud enough for James to hear, "This is the beginning of our life, baby. No more secrets." James smirked, emboldened. He believed it. He believed every word. And Beck, watching silently, caught the whisper. She didn't flinch. She didn't glare. She simply tilted her head ever so slightly, as though she knew something neither of them did. For the first time that morning, Laura felt a ripple of unease crawl up her spine. It was gone as quickly as it came, smothered under her certainty. But the seed had been planted. Because what Laura didn't know was that Beck was not one of the quiet wives who broke. She was the one who prepared. The one who waited. The one who held evidence in her lawyer's folder that could detonate Laura's entire scheme. But for now, Laura leaned back in her chair, triumphant, believing the courtroom belonged to her. She had no idea the floor beneath her was already cracking. Every piece of evidence was another stone for the fortress she was building around herself and her children. But Janet wasn't finished. She slid a second folder across the table, thicker than the first. Inside were spreadsheets, wire transfers, property deeds, and offshore account records. "Your husband has been moving money," Janet explained. "A lot of money. Over $85 million transferred into accounts you don't know about. Cayman Islands. Delaware shell corporations. Even a luxury condo in Laura's name in Miami." Beck's fingers brushed over the documents, tracing the trail of deceit. This wasn't just infidelity. This was a full-scale attempt to erase her, to strip her and the twins of everything they had built together. He's planning a divorce, Janet continued. Not the kind where you negotiate terms. The kind where he leaves you with nothing and walks away clean. For a long moment, Beck said nothing. She stared at the evidence, her heartbeat steady despite the storm rising inside her. Then, finally, she spoke. "Show me everything." From that night on, her life became an undercover mission. By day, she played the dutiful wife, smiling at James across the breakfast table, asking about his business trips. By night, she scoured documents, logged into accounts, and studied Janet's reports until her eyes blurred. She installed monitoring software on James's computer, recording his keystrokes, capturing his emails and late-night video calls with Laura. She began recording her own conversations with him, his excuses and his slips of the tongue. Each file was another weapon in her growing arsenal. The most damning discovery came one evening when Janet placed a thick stack of printouts on the table. "He's writing a script," she said grimly. Beck flipped through the pages. It was a playbook, James's notes for how he planned to destroy her. Claims of her supposed infidelity, false accusations about her mental stability, even a plan to demand paternity tests for Noah and Naomi. He was willing to question his own children's existence as his, to sever that bond, just to protect his billions. Beck's chest tightened. She remembered the day he held the twins for the first time, tears running down his cheeks as he whispered promises of love and protection. And now, the same man was preparing to erase them with a lie. "That's the line," Beck said softly, her voice steel beneath the calm. "He can come for me. But he will not come for my children." That night, she ordered Janet to arrange DNA testing. Not because she doubted the truth, she had never once questioned it, but because she wanted to be ready when James tried to weaponize his lies in court. Weeks later, the results arrived, a 99.97% probability that James Langston was the biological father of both twins. She held the papers in her hand and felt the first wave of triumph. Proof. Ironclad, undeniable proof. But there was more. Janet's investigation into Laura turned up a history so sordid it almost seemed fictional. "She's not new to this," Janet explained during one late-night strategy session. "She's a professional. 2 wealthy men before James, both married, both left their wives, both paid Laura millions to disappear. She's perfected this." Beck studied the records, the settlements, the penthouse deeds, the photographs of Laura with other marks. The realization hit her like a hammer. James thought he was the conqueror, the man writing the rules. But in truth, he was being played just as cruelly as he was playing her. Laura wasn't his partner. She was his puppeteer. And Beck would expose them both. With Patricia Holmes, her lawyer and old friend, she crafted the counterstrike. They catalogued every offshore transfer, every hotel receipt, every incriminating text. Patricia assembled a legal team, financial investigators, forensic accountants, digital analysts, all working to build the unbreakable case. The pile of evidence grew into mountains, boxes filled with records, photographs, audio recordings. "James thinks he's going to walk in there and destroy you," Patricia said one afternoon as they reviewed files. "He has no idea that you're 3 steps ahead." "He's spent 2 years planning this," Beck replied. "I've spent months preparing for him to try. That's the difference." But beneath her calm, there were nights when Beck lay awake staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of it all pressing down. The betrayal, the lies, the risk of what was to come. She thought of her children asleep down the hall, innocent, unaware of the war being waged over their lives. And every time doubt crept in, she repeated the same vow to herself: "I will not let him take them. I will not let him win." By the time the court date arrived, Beck was no longer the woman who had once begged her husband for honesty. She was something far sharper, forged by betrayal and steady resolve. She walked into Courtroom not as the victim James expected, but as the strategist he never saw coming. And as she sat quietly on the bench, watching James swagger in with Laura on his arm, her lawyer's folder heavy with evidence by her side, she allowed herself the smallest of smiles. Because this wasn't just survival anymore. It was retribution. The courtroom was already buzzing when the bailiff's voice cut through the air. "All rise." Judge Henry Whitaker entered, his expression unreadable as he settled behind the bench. He adjusted his glasses, glanced at the docket, and then at the 2 sides facing one another like combatants preparing for war. On the left, James Langston and his team of sleek attorneys, their suits sharp enough to cut glass. Behind them, Laura Carter sat in the gallery, her red dress deliberately chosen to scream confidence. On the right, Beck Langston and Patricia Holmes, her lawyer, surrounded by carefully stacked binders and boxes filled with evidence that looked heavier than stone. The judge nodded. "You may be seated." James leaned back in his chair as his lead attorney, Brian Keene, stood to deliver the opening salvo. Keene was tall, smooth-voiced, with the practiced ease of someone who had made a fortune defending men like James. "Your Honor," he began, his tone rich with indignation, "my client is here today not because he wants to be, but because he has been forced to confront a marriage built on deception. 4 years, Mrs. Langston has lived a double life, engaging in financial irresponsibility and, most disturbingly, infidelity. We have reason to believe that the twin children she claims are my client's may, in fact, not be his at all." The words hit the air like poison. Reporters in the gallery leaned forward, pens scratching furiously across notepads. James kept his face neutral, though the faintest smirk tugged at the corners of his lips. This was the moment he'd been waiting for, the humiliation of Beck, the turning of the tide. Beside him, Laura smiled proudly, crossing her legs, the picture of a woman who thought she was moments away from victory. Across the aisle, Beck sat still, her hands folded in her lap. She did not flinch. She did not blink. Patricia leaned close to her, whispering something too soft for anyone else to hear, and for a fleeting moment, Beck's lips curved in a tiny, knowing smile. Judge Whittaker scribbled notes on the pad before him, his brow furrowed. "Mr. Keene, are you telling this court that your client questions the paternity of children he has raised for 5 years?" Keene nodded solemnly. "That is correct, Your Honor. My client has every reason to believe he has been deceived." A murmur rippled through the gallery. James straightened his posture, confident now. The judge shifted his gaze toward Beck. "Mrs. Langston, your response." Patricia Holmes rose calmly, smoothing the sleeves of her navy suit. She stepped forward with measured grace, carrying a single folder in her hand. "Your Honor, my client is here today not because she has been deceptive, but because her husband has spent the past 2 years systematically betraying their marriage and conspiring to deprive her and their children of what is rightfully theirs. The defense's claims of infidelity and paternity doubts are not only unfounded, they are outright lies." Gasps spread through the courtroom. Beck remained still, her eyes fixed on James. For the first time since the proceedings began, James's smirk faltered. Patricia opened the folder and handed a document to the court clerk. "Your Honor, before we go any further, I would like to enter into evidence certified DNA test results, conducted just 3 weeks ago, at my client's request. These tests confirm with 99.97% certainty that the children in question are, in fact, the biological offspring of Mr. James Langston." The judge leaned forward as the clerk handed him the papers. His eyes scanned the results, his expression tightening as he read the undeniable truth. He looked up, his gaze settling squarely on James. "Well, Mr. Langston," he said, his voice carrying the weight of the gavel, "it appears the court has already answered your question." For the first time all morning, James's composure cracked. His lips parted, but no words came. Keene shifted uneasily beside him, clearly blindsided. In the gallery, Laura's triumphant smile wilted into something brittle, the shine of her confidence fading. Not pause to savor the moment. She pressed forward, her voice steady but sharp as a blade. "Your Honor, the accusation of infidelity is equally baseless. My client has remained faithful throughout this marriage. On the other hand, we have overwhelming evidence, photographs, hotel receipts, witness testimony, and electronic communications, that prove Mr. Langston has been engaged in a 2-year affair with his assistant, Miss Carter, who sits in the gallery today." Every head in the room turned toward Laura. She shifted uncomfortably, though she lifted her chin as if daring them to judge her. James clenched his jaw. "This is irrelevant," he muttered, but the judge's raised hand silenced him. Patricia continued, her voice gaining strength. "But adultery, Your Honor, is not the only betrayal we are here to address. My client's investigators have uncovered a deliberate and systematic attempt by Mr. Langston to hide marital assets. Over $85 million has been transferred into offshore accounts and shell corporations, funds intended to deprive Mrs. Langston and their children of what is rightfully theirs." Gasps once again filled the room, louder this time. Reporters' pens scratched faster, capturing every damning word. Patricia set a thick binder on the evidence table. "We have traced every dollar, Your Honor. Every wire transfer, every hidden account, every fraudulent maneuver. And if that were not enough, we also have this." She held up a tablet. "A recorded conversation between Mr. Langston and Miss Carter, captured from his own computer, in which they discussed their plan to question the paternity of his children as a means of avoiding child support. At that, the courtroom erupted. The judge banged his gavel repeatedly until silence returned. "Play the recording," he ordered. The room filled with James's voice, clear and unmistakable. "The sooner we can get this over with, the better. I'm tired of living this double life." Then Laura's voice, sharp, calculating, "The kids aren't baggage, James. They're not your kids, remember? That's the story we're going with. Once you establish that, you won't have to pay support, and we can move on with our lives." The sound of his own betrayal echoed through the chamber. James's face drained of color, his eyes darting wildly as though searching for an escape. Laura shrank into her seat, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, as though bracing for impact. Judge Whittaker's jaw tightened. He removed his glasses and set them on the bench with deliberate care. His voice was low, measured, but carried the force of a hammer. "Mr. Langston, I have presided over countless cases in this courtroom, but rarely have I seen such a calculated and callous attempt to defraud not only your wife, but your children. To hear a father conspire to disown his own blood for financial gain, it is reprehensible." James opened his mouth to respond, but the words died before they formed. Beck sat perfectly still, her hands folded, her eyes locked on the man she had once loved. For months she had carried the weight of his betrayal in silence, building her case, waiting for this exact moment. Now, at last, the truth was laid bare. Patricia closed her folder and returned to her seat with the quiet confidence of a general whose battle plan had unfolded with perfect precision. "No further questions, Your Honor." The courtroom sat in stunned silence, the echoes of the recording still hanging in the air. And James Langston, who had walked into the courthouse that morning with the swagger of a man certain of victory, now sat pale and trembling, his empire of lies collapsing brick by brick. The silence in courtroom be stretched thin and taut, like a rope ready to snap. The recording had finished playing, but the words lingered in the air, poisonous and undeniable. Every person present, from the reporters scribbling in frenzied shorthand to the bailiff standing stiff by the door, was staring at James Langston. Once the picture of power and wealth, James now looked like a man drowning in plain sight. His once pristine suit seemed to hang heavy on his shoulders, his skin pale under the unforgiving lights. He tried to wet his lips, to summon the commanding tone that had swayed boardrooms and investors for years, but all that came out was a thin rasp. "Your Honor, this isn't the whole story." Judge Whittaker fixed him with a stare so sharp it pinned him in place. "Mr. Langston, the story is in your own words. Do you deny that was your voice conspiring with Miss Carter to question the paternity of your children?" James shifted in his chair, his hands trembling as he gripped the wooden railing before him. I was under pressure. I wasn't thinking clearly. Laura, she was pushing me." At the mention of her name, all eyes turned to the gallery. Laura sat stiffly, her painted confidence now cracked and crumbling. The red dress that had seemed so daring an hour ago looked gaudy under the weight of her disgrace. She kept her chin high, but the muscles in her jaw twitched as if she was grinding her teeth. Judge Whittaker leaned forward, his voice colder than stone. "You are a billionaire, Mr. Langston. You are no stranger to contracts, negotiations, and responsibility. Are you asking this court to believe that you, a man who oversees empires, were manipulated into attempting to defraud your own family?" James flinched. I just, his words withered. He dropped his gaze, unable to meet the judge's eyes. The gallery buzzed with whispers. Reporters tapped furiously at their phones, already crafting the headlines. Tech mogul conspires to disown children. Langston empire in jeopardy. Every second that passed eroded James's carefully cultivated public image. Patricia Holmes rose smoothly from her chair, seizing the moment. "Your Honor, my client does not seek to humiliate Mr. Langston further. The evidence speaks for itself. He has admitted under oath to an extramarital affair. He has been exposed attempting to hide over $85 million in assets. And now this court has heard, in his own voice, a plan to disown his children for financial advantage. What more needs to be said?" The judge raised a hand. "Enough, Ms. Holmes. You've made your point." He turned his gaze back to James, his eyes narrowing. "Mr. Langston, I suggest you confer with your counsel. At this stage, your only option is complete transparency. If you attempt to withhold so much as $1 from this court, I will hold you in contempt." James's lead attorney, Brian Keene, leaned close, whispering frantically in his ear. The confident rhythm of Keene's words had vanished. Now his tone was urgent, almost pleading, trying to salvage whatever scraps remained. James nodded weakly, his hand dragging down his face as if to wipe away the ruin. But there was no wiping this away. In the gallery, Laura finally broke her silence. She stood abruptly, her heels clacking against the polished floor. "This is absurd. You're making me out to be some kind of villain, but I never." "Sit down, Miss Carter." The judge's voice cracked like a whip. She froze, her eyes wide for the first time all morning. Slowly, stiffly, she sat, her mask slipping. Beck caught the look in her eyes then, not confidence, not defiance, but the sharp flicker of fear. James slumped further in his chair, staring at the floor. His empire was unraveling in front of him, and for once, there was no assistant, no board member, no mistress to shield him from the consequences. Patricia leaned toward Beck, her voice low but certain. "He's finished." Beck didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply sat straighter, her expression calm, as if the outcome had been inevitable all along. Inside, however, a quiet storm surged. For months she had carried the burden of his betrayal, the ache of deception, the fear of what he might do. Now, at last, the scales were tipping. The judge scribbled something on his notepad before setting down his pen with finality. "We will recess for 1 hour," he announced, his voice carrying the weight of judgment. "When we reconvene, I will hear closing arguments and issue preliminary rulings regarding custody and financial disclosure." He banged his gavel. "Court is adjourned until then." The bailiff called for order as the room erupted. Reporters swarmed toward the doors, eager to broadcast the downfall of one of the city's most celebrated moguls. Attorneys huddled in tight knots, strategizing, whispering, recalculating. James remained slouched at the table, his hands covering his face, his lawyers circling him like paramedics around a wounded man. He looked smaller now, deflated, his billion-dollar aura evaporated in the harsh light of truth. Laura darted toward him as the crowd began to shuffle out, her heels sharp against the floor. "James," she hissed, her voice urgent. "Don't you dare let them do this to us. You have to fight. You have to." He jerked away from her touch, his eyes flashing with sudden fury. "Us?" His voice cracked, sharp enough for Beck to hear across the aisle. "There is no us. Look where your brilliant ideas got me." Laura's lips parted in shock, but before she could respond, one of James's lawyers grabbed his arm and pulled him aside. The scene was small, contained, but Beck saw it all, the cracks in their once flawless performance now splitting wide open. She stood with Patricia, gathering her things, her movements deliberate. She didn't rush. She didn't linger. She simply walked past James and Laura, her heels steady on the polished floor. For a moment, James looked up, his eyes meeting hers. Gone was the smugness, the arrogance. What stared back at her was something closer to fear, tinged with regret. Beck held his gaze for only a heartbeat before turning away. She didn't need to speak. He knew. The man who had entered this courthouse with a mistress on his arm and a smirk on his lips was not leaving as a conqueror. He was leaving as a man undone. As she stepped into the corridor, the flashing cameras caught her, reporters shouting questions. But Beck kept walking, her lawyer at her side, her head high. She had no need to perform for them. The real performance was inside, and it had ended with James exposed, his lies collapsing in a heap at his feet. And though the war was not yet over, the tide had shifted. The fall of a mogul had begun, and there would be no rising back from this. When Courtroom B reconvened an hour later, the atmosphere was electric, heavy with anticipation. Reporters had returned in greater numbers, the gallery now packed with curious onlookers who wanted to witness the final act of James Langston's public unraveling. Every whisper, every shuffle of paper seemed amplified as people waited for the gavel to fall again. James sat slumped at the defense table, his lawyers whispering furiously in his ear, but the billionaire looked hollowed out, his eyes bloodshot, his skin ashen. Gone was the arrogant posture of a man who thought he owned the room. He looked smaller now, like the wealth and power that had once cloaked him had slipped away, leaving only the man beneath, weak, cornered, and terrified. Laura Carter had not returned to her bold pose in the gallery. Her red dress still gleamed under the lights, but her composure had cracked. Her arms were folded tight across her chest, and she kept glancing at the reporters with visible unease, as if she could already see her name in tomorrow's headlines, and not in the way she had dreamed. On the other side of the aisle, Beck sat with quiet dignity, her navy dress as immaculate as it had been that morning. She hadn't flinched through hours of testimony, through the venom of false accusations, through the unveiling of betrayal after betrayal. Her strength wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It was written in the way she held herself, steady, unbroken, waiting. The bailiff called for order, and Judge Whittaker returned, his face grave. He settled behind the bench, glanced at the towering stacks of evidence on both sides, and then clasped his hands together. "I have presided over many divorce cases in my 23 years on this bench," he began, his voice slow, deliberate, "but rarely have I seen a matter so laced with calculated deception, financial manipulation, and moral bankruptcy." The words landed like blows, each syllable digging deeper into James's collapse. His lawyers shifted uncomfortably, but none dared interrupt. "Mr. Langston," the judge continued, "you stand before this court not as a husband seeking a fair dissolution of marriage, but as a man who conspired to defraud his wife, your partner of 8 years, and to disown your own children for financial gain. Such conduct is reprehensible." James's lips moved, a protest dying on his tongue. He gripped the edge of the table, knuckles white, but he did not speak. The judge turned to Patricia Holmes. "Counsel, please restate your client's requests for relief." Patricia stood, her voice clear and firm. "Your Honor, my client requests full physical and legal custody of the children, with supervised visitation for the defendant until such time as he completes court-ordered counseling. She requests equitable division of all marital assets, including those hidden by the defendant, totaling $85 million. We request spousal support in the amount of $2 million annually for 10 years, and full payment of all legal fees incurred in uncovering the defendant's fraudulent activity." The gallery murmured, the staggering figures sparking frantic note-taking among the reporters. James's face flushed crimson. He shook his head violently, muttering to Keene, his lead attorney, who quickly rose to speak. "Your Honor," Keene began, his tone strained but striving for composure, "while we acknowledge certain indiscretions, the requested terms are excessive. My client is prepared to offer a generous settlement." "Generous?" Judge Whittaker's voice cracked like thunder. He leaned forward, his eyes blazing. "Your client attempted to steal from his family. He attempted to weaponize his own children. There is no generosity in his conduct, only greed." The silence that followed was suffocating. "Therefore," the judge said, each word deliberate, "this court grants full custody of Noah and Naomi Langston to their mother, Mrs. Beck Langston. Mr. Langston shall have supervised visitation, contingent on his completion of court-ordered counseling and a full psychological evaluation." James's shoulders collapsed inward, his head bowing as though the weight of the gavel itself had landed on him. "Furthermore," Judge Whittaker continued, "all marital assets, including those hidden through offshore accounts and fraudulent transfers, shall be considered joint property. They will be divided equally between the parties, with immediate restitution of the concealed funds. Additionally, Mr. Langston is ordered to pay spousal support in the amount of $2 million annually for a term of 10 years, along with all legal fees incurred by the plaintiff." The gallery erupted. Gasps, whispers, frantic typing from reporters whose stories had just tripled in value. James slammed a fist against the table, his voice breaking. "This is robbery. She's taking everything." The judge's gavel struck with a crack that silenced the room. "No, Mr. Langston. This is justice." James sank back into his chair, his face buried in his hands. Judge Whittaker wasn't finished. He turned his gaze toward Laura, who stiffened in her seat. "And as for Miss Carter, this court has no jurisdiction over your personal conduct, but the evidence presented today will be forwarded to the district attorney's office. Any role you played in conspiring to defraud this family may result in criminal investigation. I suggest you secure counsel." Laura's composure shattered. Her mouth opened in shock, but no words came. She stared at James, expecting him to shield her, to defend her. But James didn't even look at her. He sat broken, staring at the floor, the mistress he once flaunted now just another liability. The judge set his pen down and leaned back, his face weary but resolute. "This court stands adjourned." The gavel fell. Beck rose slowly, smoothing the skirt of her navy dress. She gathered her things with unhurried grace, every movement radiating calm control. Patricia touched her arm lightly. "You did it," she whispered. Beck gave a faint smile, but it wasn't the smile of triumph, it was the smile of release, of someone who had carried a mountain and finally set it down. As they walked toward the doors, the reporters surged forward, cameras flashing, microphones shoved out like weapons. "Mrs. Langston, do you have a statement? Mrs. Langston, how do you feel about the ruling? Do you believe justice was served?" Beck paused, her children's faces flashing in her mind, Noah's boundless energy, Naomi's quiet seriousness. She turned to the cameras, her voice steady. "Justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes, it speaks quietly, patiently, and with finality. Today, justice spoke for my children. That's all that matters. The cameras erupted in flashes, the sound of her words echoing even after she walked away. Behind her, James was escorted out a side door, flanked by lawyers who looked like vultures circling the carcass of a fallen animal. He was a billionaire still, but stripped of his dignity, his family, and the illusion of control. Laura trailed behind, her once bright future now nothing more than a collapsing scheme, her name soon to be splashed across scandal sheets not as a star but as a parasite. Outside, the sunlight was blinding after the gloom of the courthouse. Beck lifted her chin, the warmth of the day washing over her. Patricia walked at her side, the crowd parting around them. 4 months, she had lived in the shadows of betrayal. 4 months, she had pretended to be powerless while she built her case piece by piece. Today, in her navy dress, she had stood in the light. She hadn't just survived. She had won. And as she stepped forward into the future, she knew that this wasn't just the end of her marriage. It was the beginning of a life defined not by what had been taken from her, but by what she had reclaimed, her dignity, her strength, her voice. The man who thought he held all the cards had discovered the truth too late. The woman he tried to destroy was the one who held them all along. And this time, the game was over.